That debate that won't end over the decision to go to war in Iraq. Ray Suarez begins.
In recent weeks, criticism has intensified over the Bush administration's Iraq policy, both in the run-up to the war and its aftermath. A former top-level foreign policy insider claimed the vice president and other administration officials hijacked some of the most important decisions about U.S. national security, including vital decisions about post-war Iraq. Retired Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson was Colin Powell's chief of staff at the State Department and a close friend and advisor for 16 years. 2 weeks ago, he spoke to a Washington Public Policy Institute.
What I saw was a cabal between the Vice President of the United States, Richard Cheney, and the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, on critical issues that made decisions that the bureaucracy did not know were being made.
In an interview this week, Wilkerson repeated his charge that an alternative decision-making process had evolved, run by the Vice President and his allies at the Defense Department in the first Bush term.
This is the first time that so much power had been concentrated in the office of the Vice President. While the formal process was engaged, that is to say, everyone debating and dissenting and so forth and so on, the informal process was making the decisions. There was a labyrinth out there of people who sopped up information, manipulated information, handed information, and built information, I think, in some cases, that supplemented, augmented, helped this alternative decision-making process to realize its decisions rather than those that might have been flummoxed or stopped or halted or still in debate in the formal process.
How did this work in practice?
Well, with regard to Iraq, it was centered in Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feist's office. Other people were sprinkled throughout the government.
Wilkerson says that a faction at the Central Intelligence Agency was aligned with the Vice President's office. At times, this group was in conflict with CIA Director George Tenet, the DCI.
And so you would get one part of the agency, the official part, if you will, with the DCI as the mouthpiece of that official part, saying, wait a minute, I don't think that ought to go in the President's State of the Union address. That's not right. We don't have firm evidence that Iraq is seeking uranium from the country of Niger, so it shouldn't go in there. Then you would have this dissenting body in the agency report up the chain to the Vice President's office, and back in it would go, into the State of the Union address.
Isn't this just an appropriate outgrowth of the cabinet process?
I don't think a president, if he's a wise man, is ever going to trust the critical decisions that send men and women to die and kill other people too, we forget that sometimes, to just a small entourage. It's got to suffer the debate, the dissent that's going to inevitably be there, the exposure to a wider body, to his entire cabinet, if you will, to everyone who has an opinion to offer in there.
At a press briefing this week, Secretary Rumsfeld maintained the administration's decision-making process was open, and he disputed the idea of a cabal when asked if one existed.
Of course not. My goodness gracious. The President of the United States makes these decisions, and he did it in open meetings and discussions that went on and at great length, and that's that kind of a perspective, obviously, is looking through the wrong end of a telescope. We know, anyone who looks at this process knows what it was. The President of the United States made some judgments based on the best advice he received, and he went to the Congress, and the Congress received the same information. He went to the United Nations, and the United Nations had the same information, and he made a decision. And the process, I think, was transparent, and it is what it is.
Senate will come to order under the previous.
But questions remain. Just this week, the administration's handling of pre-war intelligence about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction was at the center of a partisan dispute in the Senate. Democrats claimed the majority Republicans had delayed an investigation for over a year. After invoking a little-used rule to force a rare closed session, the Democrats got the Republicans to agree to speed up the inquiry. For Wilkerson, pre-war intelligence on Iraq was particularly affected by what he viewed as the alternate decision-making process in the White House.
I am coming to believe that the intelligence was politicized. I'm coming to believe that there was a band centered in the Pentagon that went about politicizing that intelligence. I don't doubt their sincerity. I don't doubt that they believed that they were taking the nation to war for a good purpose, removal of Saddam Hussein, whatever. I don't doubt that most of them, if not all of them, believed that he was a threat. Whether it was an imminent threat or not, I don't know. That kind of hits the line of my belief factor. But I think they got to the point where the end justified the means.
But it wasn't just intelligence. Wilkerson says the Cheney and Rumsfeld teams strongly influenced the planning of the post-war occupation of Iraq and the handling of prisoners from Afghanistan and Iraq. On the occupation,
here's what the plan was. The plan devised principally in Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feist's office. And I have to believe, if Rumsfeld is the controller, the leader he says he is, that he was fully cognizant of this. And I don't think he would have been cognizant of it without the blessings of the Vice President either. The plan was to put General J. Garner, and his organization called ORHA, on the ground in Iraq for maybe 90 to 120 days, install Ahmad Chalabi and his INC colleagues or some other lookalike in control, and then leave, withdrawing most of the major military force in the process, if not all of it, in a very short period of time. This is ineptitude and incompetence of the first order. Ever since that plan failed, we've been in a pickup game. And now we've transmogrified the mission from imminent threat and WMD into spreading democracy.
On the treatment of prisoners, Wilkerson cited a 2002 presidential directive that set new rules for handling prisoners in Afghanistan.
The president was saying in his memorandum that this was a different situation and that detainees in the war on terror and prisoners of war in a conventional conflict were different animals, so to speak, different categories. Nonetheless, he ordered the armed forces of the United States to do all that they could to comply with the spirit of the Geneva Conventions. The Defense Department, however, under the protective eye of the Vice President, took a totally different approach. And some of the atmosphere, the environment that was created principally by two things. And these are very dangerous things if you're going to get on this slippery slope. One, the insinuation that you can do things different because this is a different environment, and then the pressure to do so.
This backing off of the Geneva Accords, Wilkerson says, led to the abuses at Abu Ghraib.
There's a fine line between the brutal behavior necessary to wield force for the state and going over that line. So one of the reasons you have these codes instilled in every soldier's heart, and you have this law of war and so forth, is not just its American values, but you want to give the leaders, the platoon leaders and the company commanders and the battalion commanders, the tools to control this use of brute force for the state. When you relax those rules, you're inviting real problems. You're inviting the kind of problems we had at Abu Ghraib. I have to go back to the Vice President's office and hold it culpable too, because one of the early on aggressive participants in this debate about whether or not America could in fact change 200 years of policy was David Addington. He's the person that's replacing Scooter Libby. He was the intellectual legal guru, if you will, behind the discussion about the commander-in-chief having the right in this new situation being the war on terror, to make exceptions.
Louis Scooter Libby resigned last week as Cheney's chief of staff and national security advisor. He was indicted on 5 counts of obstructing justice, perjury, and lying in the CIA leak investigation. Libby entered a not guilty plea at his arraignment Thursday. For his part, Wilkerson says he's just reporting what he saw in the run-up to the war and still wonders if he should have spoken out at the time.
My defense is one of loyalty to a man I'd known for 16 years. My defense is that I knew that he was one of the people in the administration who would argue for moderation, who would argue for diplomacy, who would argue for alliances, who would argue for working with the world instead of against the world, who would argue for magnanimity, humility, instead of arrogance and hubris. Looking back on it now, to be very direct in answering your question, there is a part of me that regrets I didn't resign.
Margaret Warner takes